Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, I'll be giving my spoiler-filled thoughts on Shenmue III. About 3 months after its initial release, and about 1 year after I initially played the first two games, and did a video about them on the channel. And I really love Shenmue 1 and 2. There are two games I have a massive amount of respect for, both in terms of what they did for the open world genre, and also for its really ambitious narrative. And with how long it's been since Shenmue 2, which originally came out in 2001, I was unsure about how Shenmue 3 would play in a more modern day, and the reception for this game has been extremely mixed, even from the most hardcore fans. And while I have a mixed opinion of the game as well, I'm certainly more positive on it than negative. Shenmue 3 is just more Shenmue. It doesn't improve upon much from Shenmue 2, but it still gives you the same tone and style of gameplay that you would expect. But again, the previous game came out 18 years prior, and for the gameplay to be exactly the same after all this time, despite the open world genre having evolved so much even over the last 5 years, with games like The Witcher 3 and Red Dead Redemption 2, Shenmue just feels extremely outdated. But to me, that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. Now, I will talk about the story stuff more so towards the end of the video, but now let's talk about the gameplay first. So again, the gameplay is similar to that of the previous games. The open world is filled with shops and NPCs that you can interact with. And I feel like the shops had a more important role in this game than previous ones, but I feel like the NPCs and their abilities in this game were reduced from Shenmue 2. Where in Shenmue 2, you could interact with pretty much anybody in the city, and they would even take you where you needed to go. But in this game, it feels like a good chunk of the people walking down the streets weren't interactable. And while you do meet some colorful characters through these conversations, I didn't find the NPCs as helpful in this game as well. But as I mentioned, the shops are probably more important than they are in previous games. For better or worse. Where something I should mention is that the health system in this game functions very differently from previous games, where running around, even in the open world, causes you to lose health. And if you do end up in combat, that health carries over to the combat section. But you could increase your health by using food or medicine, which you do buy in shops, which also requires money, which you do get in a similar way to how you got it in Shenmue 2, which is through gambling or doing part-time jobs. And I found a lot of these systems really annoying, to be honest. I didn't love how long it took to make money in Shenmue 2. And it sucks even more in this game, where there are multiple story points where you need a lot of money before you're able to continue on with the story. So essentially, it just makes you do these things over and over and over again. And it just gets really tedious. You can get part-time jobs in this game, like wood chopping, which is, it's very redundant, obviously. And also the classic forklift driving, which was cool to see it return. That was a cool callback, but it's not fun. Gambling can be tedious as well. There are fortune tellers around the city that do give you your lucky number or your lucky color, and you can use those to increase your odds while actually gambling, but again, it's not 100% guaranteed. The game also saw the return of QuickTime events, which were just as annoying as they were in the original game, but luckily the checkpoints are right at the beginning of each sequence, so it isn't that bad. The game does have a solid amount of combat in it as well, which has always been pretty mediocre in this series in my opinion. Again, I don't feel like they did anything to improve it here. To be honest, it might even be a downgrade where your attacks never really felt too impactful. And I did spend most of my time really just button mashing, which got me through up until the Red Snakes fight, like towards the end of the game. And it's at that point that I realized that the game really makes you grind, where by training, both through sparring and through the endurance mini games, they really help you out in combat. Just through maxing out my endurance, I was able to finish the game without much difficulty from that point on. But now let's talk about the locations in the game, which are Bailu Village and Niaowu, which graphically both look nice. While the character models in the game and the animations are extremely janky, the environments are mostly really nice to look at. And it was cool to see a mostly load time free open world, unlike the previous two games. Though there are points where you're forced to walk, where you can very clearly tell the game is loading in the background during that time. Especially in Niaowu. There's like multiple sections in Niaowu where this happened, but I guess it is what it is. I do feel like Bailu Village was a better location for me though. Despite it being smaller, I felt like the level design was slightly better, and also the characters within Bailu were a lot more interesting to me. But speaking of these characters, they're so poorly acted, and the writing's still really terrible. But, I mean, I guess that's kind of the charm that you expect from Shenmue at this point. Something I found really cool in Niawu was that you were actually allowed to use your phone at the hotel to call an array of characters from the previous games. And I thought this was a pretty nice Easter egg for them to put into the game, even though most of them weren't really voiced by their original voice actors, and none of them had any impact on the overall game. But now let's talk about the main story itself, which from what I gather is overwhelmingly looked at as a disappointment. And I do partially agree, though we get some really great moments within this game. And we start off right after where Shenmue 2 left off, where we're in the cave with Shenhua, and the game pretty much revolves around finding Shenhua's father. And while that initial premise is fine, nothing actually comes of that, which I really found strange. And then when we actually get to have a real conversation with him at the very end of the game, he barely reveals anything. It was just really weird to me. But I will say I really liked Ryo's relationship with Shenhua. I really liked the first half of the game, those sections where every night you could just talk to Shenhua, have these conversations, talk to her about the current events, get her reactions. After learning about Ryo's life and things he's been through, we learn more about her. I really like those conversations, but I feel like her importance significantly decreases in the second half of the game, where you can still have nightly conversations, but pretty much all of them are revolved around what Ryo did that specific day, and on days where Ryo doesn't even do anything, it just feels like a copy and paste sort of thing, so I found that to be kind of disappointing. Ren is also in this game, and I found his appearance in this game to be really strange, where he shows up for the first time, like over halfway into the game, and the game makes like no deal of this, like they just kind of brush it to the side. And he does play a major factor at the end of the game, but his like first appearance is just kind of nothing. I mean, he was the first character outside of Ryo and Shenhua, and Chai, I guess, to appear from a previous game in this game. But again, like they just do nothing with him until the end of the game. And while he is fantastic in the old castle section of the game, but again, it takes a while to get to that point. I also didn't love the game's pacing either. I felt like everything important to the overall narrative was really rushed, while the rest of the game was really bogged down by filler in order to make the game longer, by like forcing you to learn like martial arts moves, and to do that you would need a ridiculous amount of money beforehand, and that forced you to gamble or do part-time jobs, and this really ruined the pacing of the story, where you'd spend hours just trying to get money, all to get to the next story point. But at the same time, it would be a pretty short game if those elements weren't there, and I think that's a major factor of Suzuki working with a much smaller team this time. It's really clear that this is an indie game, and I feel like that's a major reason for a lot of Shenmue 3's shortcomings. I understand why a lot of fans were underwhelmed by the story, as the narrative doesn't really move forward too much. I mean, the Bailu Village section really focuses on your relationship with Shenhua and doesn't really do much else for the narrative as a whole until the very end, where you do learn a bit more about Ryo and Landi's fathers, which gets reiterated at the end of the game when you talk to Juan anyway. But you do also learn a bit about the origin of the mirrors. The Niawu section of the game was even drier in terms of important content. I mean, this section did introduce Niao's son, who seems to be an important character in the future of the series, obviously being one of the leaders of the Chiyu men, and obviously she has a major factor in the old castle section of the game as well, which was probably my favorite section of the entire game. Well, yeah, I do wish they did a bit more here. I did enjoy what we got, though it would have been cool to see another big open world like how it was supposedly originally supposed to be. I thought it was a pretty solid set piece in my eyes. The combat was mostly easy by the point I got to it, but it was just fun to one-hit kill a lot of these random soldiers and eventually get the Landi. And I thought the fight between Ryo and Landi, even though it only lasted for a few seconds, I thought it was a really fun moment. To actually get into gameplay and fight him and not even being able to damage him, I just thought that was a good ending point for this game, as it has Ryo fighting the ultimate opponent and making it very clear that he's just not ready yet. But also in this ending, we have Niao's son betraying Landi, and I feel like this could be a pretty interesting storyline in a future game. And at the end of the game, we do learn slightly more from Juan, even though, I mean, it's a lot of just repeating information. A lot more about Landi's father and the mirrors, and how Landy was raised by the Chiyu Men and the Cliff Temple, with the game ending with Ryo, Shenhua, and Ren walking along the Great Wall of China. So I did come into this ending knowing that people were underwhelmed by it, and to be honest, I didn't hate it. I do think it's dumb that Ryo doesn't get more information from Juan, but outside of that, I do think it is a pretty solid way to end this entry of the series. Now, I get why people wanted more after an 18-year wait. I know why people wanted Shenmue 3 to be the last one in the series, but I have a lot of respect that Yu Suzuki stuck to his guns and is trying to tell the story the way that he wants to, even though it could potentially lead to it never being finished. But I think that might be it. So, I mean, overall, I did actually really enjoy my experience with Shenmue 3. There are a lot of annoying bits, a lot of things that just haven't aged well, some disappointments with the narrative, but overall, I just still really enjoyed it. I mean, it's more Shenmue. It still has the same charm that it had. It still has the same basic gameplay that it had. It's still continuing the story that it had, even though, again, minimally, but it's still continuing that story. And I do feel like I have a lot of investment in it at this point. So my original review of the first two games, I gave Shenmue 1 a 7.5 out of 10. I gave Shenmue 2 an 8.5. I don't think this game is nearly as strong as Shenmue 2 in really any aspect, but I do think it was a better experience for me gameplay-wise than Shenmue 1, even though I do think Shenmue 1 has a better narrative. So because of that, I do think Shenmue 3 probably lands at around the same spot as Shenmue 1 at a 7.5 out of 10 as well. So those are my opinions on Shenmue 3. I wouldn't mind doing a speculation video on the future of Shenmue. I feel like that's something I would really like to talk about, but that'll have to be for the future. So for now, that's the video. That's my review of Shenmue 3. Thank you for watching.